Welcome to the Cypher Podcast. I'm Brett Stewart, your host. I'm joined by David and Emily, my two trusty co-hosts in this venture of the Cypher Podcast. And I think we have a really cool show because we looked at a really fascinating topic down in the South Pole. And we're looking at a specific mission that occurred in the mid-20th century by Admiral Byrd, known as Operation HIGHJUMP. And we took a pretty deep dive on this with the remote viewing data. We found some unexpected things and perhaps some not so unexpected things, but we're going to get into that detail in the main show. In the after hours, we're going to go over a specific peculiar mission that's written about regarding Admiral Byrd, who was the main commander of the expedition. But before we jump into it, definitely head over to our website over at remoteviewingpodcast.com or cypher.com and sign up to become a subscriber if you want to get access to our after-hour shows. This will get you access to all of our back catalog of interesting targets that are available for our members. You can also find us on social media using @CypherPodcast on all the big social media platforms. And be sure to share this episode with your friend. It helps us a lot. And so with that, we should just jump right into it, I think. Antarctica, Admiral Byrd, and the mission of HIGHJUMP. Emily, I know you've done a lot of research on this. You are the expert on this topic. Where do we begin today?
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, we've done quite a bit of background research on this topic. And I'm going to start by introducing Admiral Richard Byrd and a little bit of his backstory, his accomplishments, and how the whole mission, Operation HIGHJUMP, came into being. And I think it was really driven by Admiral Byrd. So he was a participant in both World Wars. What really launched Admiral Byrd's career was his mission to the North Pole, interestingly enough, not the South Pole. He was claimed to be one of the first to fly over the North Pole. And after he came back, he was basically an all-American hero. Everyone was super proud of him, super excited. And as a result of his bravery, he was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral. And he was actually the youngest to achieve this rank at age 41. He had a special act of Congress done to allow him to be promoted. I guess normally you'd have to be older or more experienced. And then he started to turn his attention to Antarctica, to the South Pole, after having done this North Pole flight. He actually did 5 trips in total, and the one we're looking at is Operation HIGHJUMP was the 4th of 5 trips. So that just gives you a sense of this person's dedication to polar exploration, both the North and the South Pole, and that he really was a pioneer in this time.
On his third trip, some of the research that I came across when I was looking this individual up after we did the remote viewing session work, apparently the third trip, he went alone, if I'm understanding it correctly, for several months. He just weathered it all by himself, and that's in a rather hostile environment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So he basically went out into the middle of the Antarctic over the winter. And if you think about the North Pole or the South Pole, during the winter time, it's pitch black. There's no sun. Just like in the summertime, it's all sun. The day never ends. And so he went for 5 months out into the middle of nowhere by himself, because I think the military had done a psychoanalysis and realized if there were 2 or more people, they would kind of get at each other and create arguments or fights or who knows what. So for psychological reasons, believe it or not, he was required to go by himself. They basically dug this hut for him inside of the ice pack. So he went for 5 months by himself, basically like solitary confinement, and it was just pitch black dark. I mean, there's no sun coming up. And when they found him, he seemed okay. However, the medical staff that first interacted with him when he came out, they figured he had some sort of carbon monoxide poisoning because he'd left some candle running and not enough air circulation. So it was sort of seen after this third mission that he had some sort of psychological trauma or damage. I can't imagine how you'd spend 5 months underground like that by yourself and not incur some sort of an odd psychology.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert on on what solitary confinement does to someone, but I know it certainly would be really difficult to achieve something like that. And I guess that paints a picture about who we're talking about here, is that this is a guy that is looking to push things to the extreme. He's not some paper pushing desk person. He's someone who's out there trying to break records, explore new areas of the world, and push the frontier. And it seems like that made a name for him, that he was able to convince further operations after that as a result.
Yeah, that's right. So that brings us into Operation HIGHJUMP, which was by far the largest of the 5 operations that he was part of. There were approximately 4,700 people involved, personnel, military personnel. It was a Navy operation. And they had a giant aircraft carrier that they'd actually loaded up a ton of aircraft onto. So as they were going to fly out over the continent, they had to bring the aircraft on the aircraft carrier. There were many different types of auxiliary ships in the area. So the mission actually was broken up into 3 teams. One went sort of up the middle, and then 2 of them went around each side. If you just picture Antarctica as a big island, one team is going right into the center of the island, and the other 2 are going around each side of the island. The team that Admiral Byrd himself was part of went up into the middle of the island of Antarctica because it allowed them to get as close as possible to the South Pole with their ships so that they would have less distance to fly. Because I think their ultimate goal was to get into the pole itself.
You know, I watched a documentary on this after the fact, and the U.S. Navy actually recorded footage of this actual expedition. It's really a fascinating thing to watch. It's about an hour long. You can find it on YouTube, but it wasn't just like a jolly little sailboat ride down there. This is some really treacherous stuff. And then it's not just let's sail up to the shore. There's 600 miles of an ice shelf that they had to smash through to get to actual land, which took them months and months to get through.
The trouble that they had with the ice was incredible as well. I mean, I think a modern film probably would gloss over that, right? They wouldn't show just how screwed up they got. They wouldn't show the planes falling into the sea. They wouldn't show the submarine getting stuck and the guys escaping and the icebreaker coming back. It was a disaster, really, wasn't it?
It was a disaster. Some of the footage they had, it felt like a movie, but this was actually what occurred. At least that's what's documented by the Navy as real events. One of them is they had to move personnel from one of the boats over to another boat, and it was such choppy water that they put a cable or rope between the 2 boats, and then personnel zip-lined across it from one boat to the next. And at one point, the water was so choppy, the cable snapped, and the guy who was right in the middle between the 2 boats fell into this frigid ice water. And the narrator for the documentary is like, and there's only 8 minutes until he's dead, because you only can survive that long in the water. Oh, we got him just with seconds to spare. You know, that 50s movie voice overlay. So it was kind of, it was entertaining to watch, but I mean, this was no joke. These were really hard conditions and required some really hard men to go down there and survive this operation.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we do impress upon this, that the listener really understands that the conditions are just unimaginably unforgiving and harsh down there. They had to work their way through sort of this sea that's got these minor mini icebergs sort of floating everywhere, but at any time they can kind of bunch up and congeal and form these larger icebergs. And then actually, if they start moving in to where the ships are, they can crush the ships, or the ships can get stuck in the ice, and there's no one to come save you. If you're stuck thousands of miles inside of this sea ice pack, you're not getting out, and you are stuck there until hopefully the ice melts.
Yeah, they had a submarine that they brought with them, and the submarine actually didn't even make it. The submarine was one of the things that they were worried about because the hull is so fragile, and those bergs could just go right through it. It's like a can opener on a can, one of these icebergs, and it was so dangerous for the submarine that they actually had to turn it around and send it back because this is not going to make it. So they also had a specific boat that was responsible for sailing back and forth to keep freeing the other ships from the ice.
They had an icebreaker to break the ice.
Yep, but the regular boats couldn't do it.
I think they said that the steel of the hull is no thicker than the Titanic. What a way to introduce your mission.
So, to bring some RV data into this discussion, I think both of you had some very interesting touch points relating to the number 3. Brett, do you want to start us off with what you found as it relates to 3 and how we think this ties into what we actually know about the mission?
Yeah, my remote viewing data started at a rather inhospitable place. Everything was covered with snow. It was really, really cold. And I'm seeing a bunch of men there, but also an outpost of some kind. And I'll get into some of that other detail in just a minute here. But when pulling back and looking kind of at the bigger picture of what was going on, I had a very specific person kind of metaphorically drawn out as seeing 3 different doors in front of them. And I described this person as someone who was an investigator, kind of an adventurous type, someone who's looking for something or someone. And he's standing in front of 3 doors and he's like, which door is it behind? There's a goal, a stated purpose or mission, and the answer they're hoping is behind one of these 3 doors. Interestingly, as Emily already said, there were 3 different prongs to the actual expedition, 3 different forces. Admiral Byrd was only part of one of those forces. He actually flew in on an airplane from an aircraft carrier. He didn't actually go through the whole 600-mile ice shelf that had to be smashed through by the icebreakers. But there were 2 others to him, not just his own. And so my work describes him as he's looking for something. He's nervous about whatever it is. He's nervous actually about the whole entire thing. And I think we'll talk more about that later. But he's hopeful that one of these doors will lead him to the solution or the answer that he's seeking.
So I got 3 things as well. I got these guys doing this. I described it as an operation, a task with a checklist, specific steps. I had an AOL of industrial safety, where if you imagine people working on offshore oil and gas platforms, there's so much box ticking to make sure that everybody's safe. And if you don't tick the box, you get sent home. It was very rigorous with a neat, clean conclusion and 3 outcomes all lined up in a neat row. I said the outcomes were documents, something like a calendar, but I suppose if they're recording all this data over weeks or months or however long it was, you end up with a chronological record, right? And that this was proof of the finished product. It's the completed checklist. So in my session, this operation with the checklist and the documents and the calendar and all this stuff ended up getting a little bit mixed up with some other data that seemed to be about a ceremony. I was wondering, are these people like priests or, because I'm expecting this might be a weird thing given the nature of the topics we do on the Cypher podcast. So I'm thinking, okay, well, it's priests doing something. But I couldn't find any woo-woo going on. There's no magic, there's no aliens, there's no nothing going on. But there's these people doing this weird ritual activity. And they're kind of, I said it's a scene, a spectacle. It's colorful, dramatic, a mystery play. Not everyone is invited, though. And when we were watching the documentary as feedback, they do a what's it called? The crossing the equator ritual.
It's called the line crossing ceremony, which is an initiation rite that commemorates a person's first crossing of the equator. And there's another one they do that's a little bit more secretive for the Antarctic.
Well, I think we can all guess why that one's so secretive. But going back to the equator, that one, there's footage in the documentary of what they're doing, and this thing is basically a hazing ritual. They're the guys, the sailors, those big macho, definitely hetero sailors, are being made to cross-dress and crawling through all sorts of filth and kissing the bosun's belly, and there's all sorts of weird stuff going on, and this thing lasts like 24 hours. It's an ordeal. It's an initiation for sure. The perception of this thing kind of confused me because I've got all this boring industrial safety checklist stuff, and then suddenly there's this ritual thing going on. What the hell is this, right? So I probed, is there any woo-woo going on here? Do we have a secret magical ritual with the priests of ancient Egypt? Nope. There was somebody who was really into it, who was a believer, if you like, and everybody else was really just there for the crack, there for the show. So I was a little confused until I watched that documentary about what the hell this data was about. But I think we've nailed it down. The purpose of all this, the operation rather than the kissing of the belly, was the establishment of authority, pecking order, and something about casting out. So maybe the US going there in these huge numbers was about excluding other people, or other nations, I should say. And I think we'll get into what they might be excluding them from a little bit later.
So, David, I think another term for this is the court of Neptune. Neptune is a god, and then there's a person holding this big sort of staff, like a trident almost, and there's everyone's dressed up in wigs and costumes. It's definitely a maritime tradition. It seems like it's not just for this mission, but in general, it's something that sailors apparently do at various points when they cross over certain key markers like the equator or the Arctic Circle.
I think it's funny that, David, since you're really familiar with ritualistic magic cult type things, that you happen to be the one that picks up on the ritualistic stuff that's going on the mission. It's just that this ritual is just a bunch of hillbilly like sailors playing pretend on this hazing ritual on their way to the new world of Antarctica, the unexplored mystery of the South Pole. It's pretty funny.
I mean, I think it might be a little much to say that I'm very familiar with ritualistic cult-like stuff. I try not to join too many cults if I can help it.
So once the main operation arrived at the continent of Antarctica, this is the Admiral Byrd's team. They landed in a place called the Bay of Whales, which is right up inside, as close as you can get to, while you're still in the sea, as close as you can get to the South Pole. And once they got to the actual physical land over sort of the icy sea, they were set out to establish a base. And they called this base Little America 4, interestingly enough, because it was the fourth mission they'd accomplished to this particular location. And they'd actually had previously built several other bases. Now that the environment is so harsh, what ends up happening is when you're gone for a year, the ice pack itself kind of slides along and moves. So the base would get moved over, and I think they noticed this moved by sort of half a mile or something. And then actually the snow and the ice blow over top of the base and actually cover it underneath. So what they would do is they'd actually find the previous year's base if they could, and they would dig it out, and actually they'd have this underground facility or under ice facility that they would use from the previous year, and then they'd build a new one on top. So it's a really interesting dynamic there. And I think that David actually has some data that relates to this. David, did you want to share what you found in terms of the base construction?
So the very first point of target contact that I made with this was a big hole that was dug out in the ground. And I thought, is this a mine or a cave or something? And looking at it in more detail, it seemed to be the hole itself wasn't interesting. It was what was in there. So the location of this was at a place that was equidistant to other points. I said the center of the world, which is kind of right and kind of wrong, in a symbolic way. And I said it's got all these rays coming out of it, or vectors. And if you look at the bottom of a globe and see all the lines of longitude coming out of the poles, and I had a bit of a facepalm moment when I got the feedback and saw what I'd written there, but I'll know for next time. So the purpose of this construction was truth and authority, to sort of broadcast we're here and we're putting our boot print on here. And I said that there was a positive motivation to this. It wasn't a sinister thing. They weren't doing anything untowards. I said there's a positive motivation, but not a perfect plan or execution.
So they did actually call it, they called it Little America, being Americans, and they were planting American flags everywhere. And so it was definitely we're here, this is our turf, we're claiming it for America, and obviously a very positive rah-rah, where look how good we are sort of way. But it definitely fits with what actually happened.
So I got as well that this was There was a boundary around this. I said it's like a security fence. I don't know why the hell they would need a security fence in Antarctica. Maybe to keep I don't know, what is there? Sea lions? To keep the sea lions out?
Those penguins certainly are a little dangerous that are down there, so you never know.
They looked so cute, the penguins in the documentary, where the sailors are there like cutting up fish and going, oh, these little penguins are particularly fussy. They won't even eat whole fish. We have to cut them up for them. And it's like, really, I think the penguins have got you quite well trained, haven't they?
I think those were the penguins they were kidnapping to bring back to America. They were so grumpy they were getting kidnapped. They had to force feed them fish. So it was all in the name of science.
Things. So I've said about the function of this place that it was built for a purpose which became less relevant over time. It was precisely designed and constructed, but it was almost like a vanity project. It was a lot of work for the actual benefit that it ever provided. An AOL of civil engineering or that, a planned construction. I said it's part of a larger long-term project, but it's a bit of a relic at this point.
The relic once again ties back into them kind of building their new sites on top of the old sites. So there's definitely this element of it is a larger project in that they've done it many times and they're sort of building on top of what was there before wherever they could. I don't think they counted on finding the old bases, but when they did find them, they were very happy because there was even food down there that was perfectly preserved. It's basically like putting it in the freezer. And there's videos of the men eating meat from the previous year's mission because it was actually frozen.
Wasn't there even food from one of Byrd's earlier missions? I think they said it was like 17 years old or something nuts like that, but it's just been in the deep freeze and it's all perfectly good.
That's right.
Maybe from the time he was underground for 5 months. So it's interesting you mentioned that because there's another bit of my data that says there's a thing with a function of container, and it's so we know where all the something is, which I guess is maybe Byrd's stash of steak and pies and cigarettes and whatever else he had hidden away down in there. That in the documentary you see them uncovering, and he goes down the ventilation shaft, like down this tiny little tube, and then pokes up a pole so they can dig it out, and then you see them all scooping all this food out that's been left in his bunker, and it's just good as new after 17 years of Antarctic deep freeze. So the ending of this whole structure project thing, I used the word decommissioning and abandonment, and got this quote: "We don't do that anymore. It's superfluous to requirements. With hindsight, it seems almost a bit of a folly. We didn't really need this."
Yeah, so the bases that they were building, they were spending all this energy taking all of their supplies off of the ship, constructing the base. Now, if they had overwintered like they did in the third mission, they did actually need to build the base because they were literally being left there over the winter by the ships. The ships can't stay in this ice harbor over the winter, so they would drop the men off into the harbor. They'd build Little America 3 or the 2 previous versions of this camp, and then they would overwinter there. In this particular mission, they had an inordinately large amount of ships. They had aircraft carriers. They could have comfortably accommodated all the people right on these ships from the looks of it. But then they built this base, and they were only there for less than 2 months. I think it was 40 days in total. So it seemed like a lot of effort to build this camp that they were only really using for 40 days. So definitely fits with your sentiment there, David, from your session.
Well, they were supposed to be there for longer than 40 days, though, right? They had to come home early.
They were, and we'll get into some of the speculations as to why, because that's where a little bit of the woo comes into this episode. So, Brett, I know you also got some data as it relates to the Little America base specifically. Do you want to share that with our listeners?
Yeah, my site location matches the known record and also what was in the feedback material. What I described in my summary is the site itself is a very remote location and it's oddly quiet. I see long makeshift roads and vehicles on them. It's frigid here, and I hear voices which carry over long distances. There are men that are huddled very close together. They seem to be talking, be jovial in nature. The men that were there in my site, they felt a little bit like hillbilly, kind of simple, but kind of easygoing type of individuals. So hillbilly type folks is what I got in my session. And I also got that at the site, there were all of these A-frame structures. They reminded me of like having a cabin in the woods in the sense that they were very much off the beaten path. These are so far removed from society or cities, and they seem to have been built in this remote location for the purpose there.
Yeah, the Navy at the time actually used large, I think, canvas tents, and they did have a bit of an A-frame look to them. So they just row after row after row of these basically A-frame shaped tents were lined up, and that's basically what the whole Little America base or town looked like.
I think in the documentary they called it Tent City and said, now the men are pleased to be back home at Tent City. And they were just like big bell tents, just as far as the eye could see.
Now, I wouldn't recommend signing up for one of these to stay at on Airbnb because the rest of my data, I was getting the impression that the location felt like a World War II concentration camp. So I was in the right era, but it wasn't a Nazi concentration camp. This was a kind of a concentration camp of their own choosing, or the choosing of their superiors saying, you're going to Antarctica and you're going to like it. And so, but I got like these prisoner type vibes that that the men there didn't have a choice in the matter. They were horrible living conditions with snow on the ground. The quarters for the men were more like prison cells than rooms. And all of these men are here. The purpose, and we're going to get into this, I think, in a minute, but is that the men are searching for the answers to something, the answers to a story. So really horrible living conditions. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be hunkering down in these A-frames.
Not only were these people stuck there, because there was basically no way to leave, you'd have to, the ship wasn't leaving until the mission was over, so they definitely were in a way kind of constrained to this location. And the conditions were harsh. It was very cold. They had very limited rations in terms of what they could eat. But because it was summer, and summer in the South Pole basically means no darkness, so 24 hours of daylight, there are reports that they just basically worked around the clock. Like they just didn't, because their time was so limited, they just worked basically 24/7 to build this camp and to get everything set up for their mission. And that brings us into an interesting question as to what was the purpose of this mission? Why did they go to the Antarctic? And why did they go specifically around this time? This was right after the Second World War, and a lot of the world's armies, at least in the Western world, were pretty decimated, including the navies. And this was a lot of resources to dedicate to something that presumably was just for exploration, for science. And we actually have a list here. Brett, do you want to share with our listener what the official purpose of this mission was? So give us a little bit of context.
Yeah, the official report by the U.S. Navy has 5 different bullet points of why Operation HIGHJUMP was commenced. The first one was training personnel and testing equipment in frigid conditions. They showed video of this. One of them was a wetsuit, interestingly enough, where they were testing to see whether or not their design of a certain material, they could go down into the water and stay for longer than 7 to 8 minutes. And they seemed to be successful. The men were in the water for over 30 minutes in these wetsuits, just fine. So the first was training, testing equipment for frigid conditions. Second was determining the feasibility of establishing and maintaining bases in the Antarctic to investigate other additional sites. It was kind of like the first doorstep to colonization, but determine whether or not it was feasible. Third was to develop techniques for establishing, maintaining, and utilizing air bases on ice, with a particular attention to later applicability of such techniques to operations in interior Greenland. This was one of the things I think that they were hoping for. I mean, you have to understand that this was a vast unexplored continent. What was there was a mystery. And what they found, one of the things they found, at least in the shown documentary, was what they found is there are lakes interior that are melted and it's fresh water there. Now there's no greenery. It's like the high desert, but there's video of this on the documentary where there's freshwater lakes just available there.
I think they said they did find life in the lakes, but it was algae. It wasn't even plant life. So no mammoths.
I think what David was alluding to there was some of the lore in terms of why people speculate this mission took place at all, because it does seem rather odd given the amount of resources that were expended relative to the recency of the war, and maybe it wasn't all purely scientific.
Yeah, the official documents don't say anything about mammoths or searching for those, but the final two objectives just had to do really with scientific research. It's just looking for certain types of minerals, expanding the knowledge about the continent, looking for certain electromagnetic phenomena that maybe might exist to find, like, let's see, is there coal down there? Are there certain minerals here? And they would fly planes with certain detection devices under them to look for these types of resources. So overall, it was a military training expedition. It was a science expedition, and it was to put a foothold down on a continent to say, we're here. Let's see if we can add more of us here. And those were really the main stated goals.
Interestingly enough, the determining of the feasibility of whether or not they were going to have a base in the Arctic was at the time not an officially stated goal. There was some controversy around that later because now there are treaties in place where nobody owns the Arctic, but kind of some countries do. And so it was this sort of like, well, we're going to establish our presence, but then we're not going to claim ownership. And officially we can't say we want to own it, but we kind of do. So it gets a little bit gray there. But definitely it seems like that presence or projection of power was part of this mission.
I absolutely got elements of that in my session data. The function of this activity that they were doing was described as maintaining authority by maintaining spectacle, and sending 5,000 Marines and aircraft carriers and submarines and helicopters and planes, even if they did drop some of them in the sea, down to the South Pole is a hell of a spectacle. The idea you just raised there about we kind of want it, but we don't want other people to have it. If you, as a nation state, if you're treating natural resources as like a zero-sum game, then you want to get the resources, but if you can't get the resources, you can also benefit in relative terms by preventing other people from getting the resources. And I think it's interesting that the Antarctic Treaty was signed shortly after this high jump debacle, where everybody agreed they weren't going to go to Antarctica and they weren't going to do anything, which may have something to do with the natural resources that were detected, which, according to that documentary which we watched on YouTube, which must be true because it was released by the US Navy, there was vast natural resources discovered in Antarctica.
Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence of the US Navy lying in recorded history, so definitely take that documentary at face value. But this actually does lead us into some of the more interesting stories about Operation HIGHJUMP. And if this is likely something, if you've heard about this before, the actual mission itself and the hardship and the real guts that these men had to go do these things is probably not what you've heard. You've probably heard these other stories that are in popular culture, more woo culture, about the Nazis at the South Pole and how they fled there after World War II, set up these bases, and even UFOs. And Emily's been kind of our main point on the research for the woo. What is out there in relationship to that? Because I know there's just this huge epic lore around high jump and Nazis and UFOs and the world. And what is that about?
Right. So I think it starts with this mission that happened out of Nazi Germany prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. There was a mission to the Antarctic. It was on this, the main ship involved in the mission was called the New Schwabenland. And I think that it's hard to disentangle if that was just the name of the ship or if the ship was actually also associated with the base that the Nazis were trying to establish. Interestingly enough, Admiral Byrd himself was invited to join this mission because at that time there was not a war going on yet, and so there weren't hostile relationships between America and the Nazis in Germany. Admiral Byrd did decline, so he did not join this mission, but there was a ship that was going down to the Arctic. Officially, the reason for this mission was to collect whale blubber or whale fat for the production of margarine. So the German army would have had to get a lot of high fat foods for their soldiers. And as silly as it seems to us in this modern time, that was something that was very hard to come by in those days. And apparently they had to find additional sources of this food so they could spare a ship to go down and collect it. Now, if you think about the scope of the mission that the Americans sent down in the 1940s, the Operation HIGHJUMP, there were dozens of ships, dozens of planes, and they just barely managed to establish a small camp of tents. The lore goes that the New Schwabenland, one ship, possibly a couple more, went into Antarctica. Not only did they get onto the land, the physical part of the continent, but then they bored through. I've heard stories that people claim the Nazis actually bored through underneath the ice for hundreds of miles to establish a giant underground network of caves. The resources required to do that, it seems completely impractical. I mean, this is a country preparing for a world war. How they would have had the resources to spare. There aren't even resources available in modern times to achieve something like this. I mean, it would be a struggle.
I can't imagine that the technology to bore through things like that would have also just been readily available back then. I mean, it's difficult today to do this kind of stuff. So I guess it's not impossible, but because there certainly were underwater submarine bases during World War II, but that far away from civilization just seems like a Herculean task that we already know how difficult it was for high jump to do this basic stuff, but to do this down there, it seems less likely.
Well, high jump was conducted without the benefit of the secret UFO technology developed as a result of channeling conducted by the Thule Society, so maybe there was secret Nazi technology which enabled them to dig those tunnels. It wouldn't be the first time that we've heard stories of implausible tunnel digging technology, would it?
Yes, the inner Earth stories. And those, I think, Emily, I know you did research on those too, but you'll have to wait until after hours to hear about one of the famous supposed missions of Admiral Byrd that has UFOs and mammoths and inner Earth and all the things included. We're going to deep dive into that and look into the merit of it. But what else is here, Emily, as far as the Nazis were concerned? What other stories about the true mission of high jump exist that may have shown up?
Right. So they went into Antarctica, supposedly, this is the high jump mission now, to go and find this secretive Nazi base. One of the things that jumped out to me right away is supposedly where this Nazi base was drilled into the continent of Antarctica was actually on the far side. So it was one of the legs of the mission that went around the far side, around the left side of the continent. But it didn't seem like the main energy of this mission was really directed at that area at all. So one of the first things that jumps right out is that they're not even looking where supposedly the New Schwabenland hit land or went ashore. So that's a bit odd right off the bat. There's also the lore of UFOs. So not only did these Nazis build a base down there, supposedly, but they had UFO technology. So it's like humans built UFOs. And part of this lore is that the reason that the mission actually got cut short is because the ships had full-on battles with UFOs. We're talking lasers, ships coming up out of the water, guns being fired, and that they actually just gave up and retreated. That this massive military force just retreated because they had a giant UFO fight.
So an interesting thing in my remote viewing data is I actually got that the site is associated with the idea of UFOs for some reason. And it didn't make any sense to me because when I actually looked around the site and I put my perception and I see, oh, there are these cabin type structures, these A-frames, these hillbilly type men that are there. It almost feels like a concentration camp, but there was no woo anywhere to be found in my session. But then just out of left field, the idea of, oh yeah, and by the way, UFOs and potentially missing time and a bunch of other strange things, these ideas are relevant to what you're looking at, but they're not actually there. And so what I interpreted that as in the session is, oh, this is the lore that I'm actually picking up on in the remote viewing session. These ideas are so prevalent. These ideas are so spread out through the popular culture. They're so a part of this idea of high jump nowadays that I'm actually picking up on it in the remote viewing work, even though there's no, at least according to what my initial work here is describing, no real merit, at least at the ground site, at the actual mission itself. There's this thing in remote viewing called stage 4 overlay, One example of this can be where if the tasker has some ulterior motive for the remote viewer, like they're going to use the session data to blackmail someone or use for some nefarious purpose, that the viewer will actually pick up on that information first, and then the site data comes out after the fact. And it'll be really weird to the viewer because the viewer will be like, I'm describing a person who has a huge ego, is full of themselves, and wants to threaten someone. Oh, and then here's this other thing that's totally unrelated.
Which leads us on to a very important question. As our tasker, Emily, who are you really working for? Do you have an ulterior motive?
Oh, no.
David, I could tell you that, but let's just say you wouldn't be able to talk about it.
I would have been taken in one of them Nazi UFOs.
So I know we're talking a bit lighthearted about UFOs, and as someone who's seen a UFO with my own two eyes, I don't want anyone listening to this to make it seem like we're making fun of this entire topic, because I actually, and I believe probably all of us believe that there's merit to this idea of unidentified flying phenomena, and there's videos of it that are indisputable. It's just in this case, it's not in the data. And this is something that's important, is we're getting all of this information about the base camp, about the men, about the expedition, about the purposes, but there's no woo. The only woo is semi-woo, is David's ritual, which there's feedback for. It's more than likely he's describing this hazing ritual on the boats.
Well, when I described that ritual, I thought, oh, here we go. Here's the woo-woo. I probed for woo-woo. I checked, is there anything weird going on here? Nothing. The weirdest, most out there, magical thing going on there is people's belief and intent, stuff people do every day. There's no woo in my session work.
Yeah, I had the same thing.
So, Brett, you talked about this notion of a stage 4 overlay and how you were able to, because it was your UFO related data came in this format of a stage 4 overlay, that you knew immediately it was more about a story about the topic than the topic itself. Can you describe to the listener how that overlay manifests in your remote viewing sessions, what that looks like, and how, as a trained remote viewer, you can discern this from actual site data?
Yeah, so there's a point in the session where when I was describing the actual residences, I have logs, a rustic feel. It's a quiet evening. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's like sound would travel a very long distance. And then I just immediately had this picture, like it just flashed in my mind. It's like, oh, there's a big UFO in the sky and it's making lights and abducting people. And I was like, wait, is that real? And then I put my attention back on the site, and I see the site without the UFO. It's just the standard in the middle of nowhere, snow on the ground, rustic feel again, no UFO there. And then well, what is this? And so in my high level data, I actually prompt myself, where is this coming from? Like, what is the source of this information? Because it's not congruent with the information that I'm getting about the site. But when I prompted that, I immediately got the impression this is a big overlay idea. A big overlay idea is lore. It's what other people think about the site, not what data exists at the site.
This is actually like metadata, right? This is data about your data, which is one of the many fascinating things about remote viewing. We can remote view our own remote viewing while we're remote viewing it. We can interrogate the source and nature of our data as we're receiving it.
Yeah, we can do that in real time. This is certainly not something that a beginner remote viewer probably has the skill set to do, but I've been doing this for more than a decade now, and you start to pick up on some of these nuances the longer you do this, and the more, once you reach thousands of sessions of thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours in this, you start picking these things up like, wait a minute, there's something unique or novel about this data point. And in this instance, that's what this was. I interrogated, what is this idea? Why does it feel like this thing isn't there, but the idea is related to the site? And it's just because it was a story.
Yeah, I tend to just know, there will be a vibe or there'll be an idea behind the idea of a particular data point that makes me go, wait a minute, that's not really UFOs in the sky. What is this? And there's going to be something which pops up and makes me ask that question.
Yeah, and there's ultimately two different types of remote viewing data. You have site data. So this is the bricks and the mortar and the people and the life forms. It's the objects that exist in physical reality. But then you also have remote viewing data that are ideas and concepts. And you as the viewer have to be able to parse which is which. And in this session, it's just what jumped out to me is that this UFO thing was not one of those objects. It was one of those concepts.
I think it's really important that you both made this distinction so that our listeners can understand that we not only get data through remote viewing, but we have the wherewithal to correctly or to accurately interpret it. And this is based on just, as Brett said, many thousands of hours of actual practice remote viewing with feedback to know when it's information that's coming in from some lore or from what actually as a human consciousness that we're projecting onto the site. If you imagine the millions of people on the internet that have watched countless videos on various social media platforms on, oh, it's going to be Nazi UFOs in the Antarctic and Admiral Byrd went to find them. Well, that's going to come through. That's sort of collective subconscious energy around this particular topic is going to come through and bleed into the sessions. It's just important to be able to identify it.
Yeah, that's particularly an issue in remote viewing projects looking at unfeedbackable high strangeness things where there's also really strong opinions, where nothing happened or what really happened was super boring, but there's thousands of people who believe really strongly that something weird happened. And what can happen, especially with beginner remote viewers, is your attention can wander in time and space. It's called displacement technically, but it just means, ooh, shiny. You get distracted by things. So if your tasking is go to this event, tell me what happened, and you go there and it's boring and the land is boring and there's nobody here and nothing happened and it's dull, you will quite naturally look around. Well, what am I supposed to be looking at? What am I supposed to be describing here? What does the tasker want to hear, or what do they want to know about? And you can immediately zoom into whatever the collective unconscious thinks, or however you want to model it. You can immediately kind of get magnetized onto this story and describe that. And this, I think, happens more often than people would like to consider with remote viewing, where the data looks legit because it matches with the tasking, but what we've actually described is a conspiracy theory, and we've not differentiated it from physical nuts and bolts ground truth.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth mentioning that I don't think the data suggests that the actual expedition may not have been also looking for Nazi forces down there. Certainly, it's not going to be in the documentary by the Navy that, oh, yeah, by the way, we're also just double checking to make sure there's nothing down there. But in the remote viewing data, we didn't describe that they're looking for platoons. That wasn't there. My work did describe that they were investigators, that they were looking for something down there, but that something never came back as military forces.
I have a very weak conspiracy thread from my data that's not even really a conspiracy thread, but it's the idea that somebody may have thought there's something weird down there and I want to go find it. And from all of the data that I got, it looks like they didn't find it. I described this thing as like a folk legend or a story that had been hugely overblown. Maybe it was even something that Byrd said when he came back from one of his previous missions, because I got this idea that there's this normal guy doing non-weird, non-woo-woo things, and then stories get told about him and stuff gets added on. And there's this idea of going to look for this in the hopes that it's just going to kind of show up and fall into their laps. So I wonder, I mean, very senior military planners are human beings and they have little hunches that they're embarrassed to say, well, I hope maybe if we go to Antarctica, we'll find, they're just like everybody else in that way. So if this mission's going on, perhaps there is somebody who has that hope that maybe there is something super cool that we're going to find. But I investigated that data and I described it as overblown, a folk legend with stories on top of stories that it's just a normal guy doing normal stuff. Even that, there was no woo-woo in there.
So Byrd himself, we have to be mindful of the fact that he even knew that this New Schwabenland mission was taking place because he was invited to join it. And so there's probably something in the back of his mind. It's like, now that the war is over, we're victorious, we won. Whatever happened to those people that went down there before the war? Maybe we just got to go follow up on them. I mean, he hadn't been back since they had gone. His third mission was prior to the New Schwabenland mission. So we thought, well, maybe let's just let's double check and make sure we actually won. And we wiped the floor with these people. There's no forces hiding somewhere in the hinterland of the Antarctic.
Yeah, they can take their aircraft carrier around there and steal all their whale blubber.
Exactly. They got all you can eat margarine. So out on the internet, there's speculation abound as to why this mission ended so soon. So they put all these resources in, and after just 40 days, even though the previous missions had all been much longer, why did they just pack up and leave the Arctic? And getting into the woo side of things, the legend is, well, they had a UFO battle and they lost. They basically got beaten and had to retreat. That's not evident in our RV data, obviously. But if you go out there and look at the actual documentary that the Navy put out, you do realize just how dangerous this ice was, and how actually the Antarctic summer had come to an abrupt end, and there were basically icebergs moving into the area. So it was sort of like, well, we have to leave now, or we may not get out of here. And they weren't planning on overwintering, as far as I can tell. So unfortunately, they had to do their work and get out of there as quickly as possible because the weather had actually turned on them. So in this particular case, it does seem like there's a very prosaic, a very mundane explanation for why the mission had to end. And that, coupled with the fact that we didn't find any woo, really leads us to land more on the side of this was just bad weather, bad luck, and things had to be wrapped up pretty quickly. On their way back to America, they ended up having to stop into various ports. And one of the first stops they made was in Chile. And there was an interview that was very famous. It's been quoted many times, that Admiral Byrd apparently gave to one of the newspapers in Chile. I think, David, do you have the text for that handy? Maybe you can read that to the audience.
I do. I just want to say, I think it's quite ironic in light of the idea that they were looking for Nazis in Antarctica that they then stopped off in South America where all the actual Nazis were hiding. I think that was Argentina rather than Chile, right? So going back to the idea that Byrd or somebody else senior may have thought that there was something that should be investigated, that was a hunch that they wouldn't have spoken about publicly, that thought, I want to go down there and have a look and just check. On the way back, Byrd gave this interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, and the translation reads, Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. The Admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anyone, but the cruel reality is that in the case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles.
There's actually a lot more to this article that we'll get into in After Hours. There's some eerie warnings that we think that perhaps Richard Byrd might have been hinting at. Maybe it has something to do with what he discovered, because he did some solo flights out over the pole. And there's a lot of people who think that this particular interview he gave was more of a harbinger of things to look out for as a result of what happened on his flight.
Yeah, and I think that's going to lead us into our after-hours show. We actually have a lot of topics to still discuss about Project HIGHJUMP. What the after hours is going to focus on first is our remote viewing data surrounding a particular flight that Admiral Byrd underwent that has so much high strangeness reported with it. There's UFOs, there's inner Earth stories, there's a message from a civilization that lives there for the rest of humanity. There's also missing time and some strange flight patterns associated with his aircraft. And a lot of this comes from a very mysterious journal, which we're going to take a look at, that supposedly was found after the death of Admiral Byrd by his son. So we're going to go into the stories that are in there. We're going to go into the remote viewing data, looking at this very mysterious flight that's referenced, where all of these fantastical things are claimed to have occurred. We're going to show you our information on the subject, and then you can make your own mind up on what the truth of the matter is. So I hope you enjoyed joining us on this expedition down to the Arctic, uncovering what was associated with the idea of Operation HIGHJUMP. And perhaps what was more interesting is what we didn't find. We didn't find the strange woo elements that are often purported online and in the mystery magazines that you find on the internet. So it was just a bunch of really hardworking men who had some amazing grit building a camp in the ice of Antarctica. And it's really impressive, I think, after watching the documentaries, looking at the work, looking at the living conditions that they were in, that they were able to achieve what they did. So certainly there were larger geopolitical reasons, I think, for this that are just obvious, because it's a whole bunch of resources up for grabs that, don't touch our resources. But maybe there was someone else. Maybe there was a different geopolitical power that was already there, that was telling them, hey, hands off our goods. Well, you'll have to find out in after hours if that actually occurred through the lens of remote viewing. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you want to get access to the After Hours show, head over to our website at cypher.com or remoteviewingpodcast.com, and you can subscribe to become a member to get access to our entire After Hours back catalog. We have other shows like Bigfoot, The Coral Castle, Atlantis, you name it. We talk about a lot of other really interesting subjects, so don't miss out on those. If you want the second part of this discussion on High Jump, you can find us there as well. Also find us on social media, Cypher Podcast, and share this episode with your friends. It helps out a lot when you do that. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.